Welcome to Lo-Fi Stories. I'm Harry, your quiet guide for tonight's mystery. Before we begin, take a deep breath, and tell me where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. The Disappearance at Blackthorn Station. Chapter 1, A Signal That Never Came. There are places in England where the air itself remembers. Where fog is not a curtain but a witness. And where even the crows pause, as though they, too, are holding their breath. Blackthorn Station was one such place. A forgotten pin on the southern rail map, it sat nestled between sloping fields and ancient trees. It had no pub. No inn. Not even a proper road, just a crooked path of gravel that refused to be tamed. Trains stopped there only twice a day, once in the pale hush of morning, and once in the lonely swell of dusk. On one such dusk, a man vanished. And with him, so did the silence of Blackthorn Station. It was the 17th of October 1892. The leaves were turning, the wind was damp, and the evening train from Windermere had just pulled in. The platform, as always, was near empty, save for the station master, a girl of 9 with her dog, and a single passenger stepping off. That man was Mr. Geoffrey Wren, a solicitor of fair reputation, known for his punctuality and particular distaste for delays. He had boarded the 4:45 from Windermere, en route to Blackthorn to collect documents related to an old inheritance. His briefcase was locked, his coat crisp, and his pocket watch freshly wound. He stepped off the train. Nodded to the child with the dog. Checked his timepiece. And then, he was gone. Not an hour later. Not in the night. But within 10 minutes of stepping onto the platform, Mr. Geoffrey Wren disappeared as though swallowed by the earth. There was no scream. No rush of feet. No carriage. No witness. Only the signal box recorded a change, a flicker of light that should not have glowed, a switch that had not been touched. 3 days passed before anyone in London heard of it. It was not the police who reached out. Nor the press. But a woman, elderly, sharp-tongued, with a letter penned in the most elegant of hands. That letter found its way not to Scotland Yard, but to 221B Baker Street. When Holmes read it, his eyes did not blink. When Watson read it, he didn't quite understand. But when Holmes read it aloud, everything changed. My dear Mr. Holmes, you once told me that no disappearance is ever perfect. I hope you still believe that. Blackthorn is a quiet place. Too quiet. I fear it has remembered something it was meant to forget. And in doing so, it has taken someone from me. Geoffrey would not vanish. Not without a trace. And if he did, then it was by design, not error. There is a clock here that has not chimed since the war. It rang yesterday. I think that is enough to warrant your attention. The signature was simple. Margaret Wren. His mother, Watson said, surprised. Or someone cleverer, Holmes replied. Pack your bag. We leave at dawn. Blackthorn greeted them with fog. It rolled across the fields like breath across glass. The station appeared out of it, sudden, strange, and shivering with an absence too loud to ignore. Its white paint peeled. Its benches slumped. Its lamp flickered, even in daylight. Stationmaster Harold Blythe met them at the end of the platform. His eyes were bloodshot, and he held his cap as though it were the only thing still under his control. I told the constable, Blythe said, but they reckon the man just walked off. Holmes glanced around. Walked off, where? The stationmaster looked over his shoulder at the endless fields. There's nowhere to go. Just farmland. And the woods. But no path leads in. Not really. And yet, Mr. Wren is not here, Holmes murmured. Blythe pointed toward the signal box. That light, that signal, changed 10 minutes after he arrived. But no one went in. No one went near it. It hadn't even been cleaned in a week. The switch pulled itself. Watson raised an eyebrow. Mechanical error? No, Holmes whispered, a signal that never should have come. Therefore, it was not a mistake. It was a message. They entered the signal room. Inside, it smelled of coal, dust, and lavender. A strange scent for a room of levers and wires. Holmes knelt beside the panel. His fingers ran across the floor. Dust. But with a single print in it, a boot print facing the door. Not coming in. Not stepping out. Just there. Frozen. Someone waited here, Holmes said. But not for the train. He found the old telegraph wires still strung under the panel. One was newly cut, sliced clean, and tucked neatly behind a drawer. And someone didn't want the next message to get through. Mrs. Margaret Wren awaited them at her cottage. She was elegant, even in grief, and her presence filled the room like the scent of rain. He was coming for the letters, she said. They belonged to my grandfather. We kept them hidden. Wartime things. Nothing terribly important. But Geoffrey said something in them might be valuable. Valuable to whom? Holmes asked. She hesitated. I do not know. Were you expecting him that night? She shook her head. He sent no telegram. I only knew he had arrived because Daisy, the child with the dog, came running to say he'd given her a coin and patted her head. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And when the train left, you did not see him again? No, she whispered. But the clock rang. The old grandfather clock in the sitting room. It hasn't rung since my husband died. That's how I knew something had gone wrong. That night, Holmes sat at the platform alone. Fog moved like a beast. The signal light glowed. And far in the distance, a sound echoed through the fields. Not a scream. Not footsteps. But the click of a clock that should not have moved. Thus begins the case of the disappearance at Blackthorn Station. A missing man. A switched signal. A broken wire. And a station where time plays tricks and silence lies. But Holmes knows better than to fear the quiet. For in the quiet, truth has the loudest voice. And in Blackthorn, something was waiting to be heard. Chapter 2, A Town That Locks Its Doors Early. The village of Blackthorn was not the sort that welcomed outsiders. Its charm was modest, low stone walls, chimneys puffing thin ribbons of smoke, and cottages pressed close like they whispered behind closed windows. But beneath this postcard stillness, there lay something that turned one's stomach, like a piano out of tune, or a smile stretched a shade too wide. Holmes and Watson, having left the desolate station behind, now walked into the heart of the village. Their boots tapped against the cold cobblestone, echoing like unwelcome footsteps. It was barely 5 in the evening, yet shutters clapped shut as they passed. Curtains twitched. Doors, one by one, clicked behind them. The village was drawing itself inward, recoiling from the world, or from something worse. I feel as though we've walked into a painting left too long in the rain, Watson muttered. Holmes said nothing, but his sharp eyes were busy, noting every glance, every turn of a key, every dog that barked without reason. They found lodging at the Stag's Hollow, the only inn in town, run by a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Netheridge. Her face was stern, her hands thick and flour-dusted, and she spoke with the practiced pleasantry of someone who'd stopped expecting answers. "I suppose you've come for the inspector," she said, offering no tea. "We've come for answers," Holmes corrected. "Inspector Lindrell is missing." Mrs. Netheridge's mouth twitched, then flattened. "Yes, well. That's not unusual here." Holmes tilted his head. "You've had disappearances before?" She turned to the hearth. "Some places are cursed, Mr. Holmes. Blackthorn doesn't have ghosts, it just has bad memory. Best not to dig." Watson stiffened. "But someone must have seen something. The man couldn't have vanished into air." Mrs. Netheridge gave a slow, grave smile. "That's exactly what he did, Doctor." They retired early, but Holmes was far from restful. He stood by the window, watching the quiet town as a clock struck 7. A single figure moved outside, a boy, no more than 10, dragging something wrapped in burlap toward the woods. Holmes leaned closer. He was gone by the time Watson turned to ask, "Anything?" "Only shadows," Holmes replied. "But shadows always lead to light, if one dares to follow." The next morning, Holmes paid a visit to the Blackthorn constable. A short man with a nervous mustache and the name Constable Harrow, he was halfway through wiping his glasses when Holmes introduced himself. "Sherlock Holmes," he said. "You've heard of me." The man froze. "Yes. Yes, of course. What brings you to?" "Inspector Lindrell." "Missing?" Constable Harrow fidgeted. "Yes. Disappeared 2 nights ago. No note, no struggle. Just, gone." "Where was he last seen?" "Platform 2. The very place I arrived," Holmes said, eyes narrowing. "Curious. Did he leave any possessions?" "A notebook. Not much in it. Mostly train schedules, and this." Harrow handed over a folded sheet of paper. Holmes examined it. A child's drawing. A train, with no tracks beneath it. Only fire. And above, written in a childish scrawl, "I heard the scream. But no one else did." Holmes held it in silence. "Who gave him this?" "No one knows. He found it pinned to the door of his room." That evening, Holmes walked alone to the station. The sun was low, bathing the platform in gold, but the air was dry and bitter. He stood where Lindrell had stood. He listened. And then, faintly, the wind shifted. A distant sound. Not the cry of a train. Not footsteps. But a scream. Echoing. Like it had slipped through a tear in time. He turned. No one. Just the silence. Waiting. Chapter 3, The Man with No Luggage. The morning in Blackthorn dawned quiet, too quiet for a town that claimed to live. Fog rested low upon the rooftops, seeping like breath from beneath a locked door. By 7, the village had resumed its haunted rituals, doors remained bolted, shopkeepers swept invisible dust, and children avoided eye contact with their own shadows. Sherlock Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to the station. Platform 2 sat still in the morning light, a rusted bench, a cracked timetable, and tracks that hadn't shivered with the weight of a train in over a week. The wind whispered through the signal wires, but Holmes heard something deeper, the rhythm of absence. He studied the ground. No signs of a struggle, he murmured. But the absence of struggle is not the absence of foul play. Watson arrived moments later, clutching a folded newspaper and a half-eaten apple. "I spoke to the butcher," he said. "He says the inspector passed through the village square the day he vanished. Alone. But odd thing, he wasn't wearing his uniform." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Strange indeed. He wouldn't have gone off-duty in a village like this, especially while investigating disappearances. Was anything else unusual? Watson hesitated. He wasn't carrying his case. Holmes turned slowly toward his friend. Not even his travel bag? Nothing. Just walking as if he had nowhere to be. Holmes knelt at the edge of the platform and examined the metal rails. "Then let us assume, for the moment, that Inspector Lindrell intended to vanish. That would explain his lack of belongings, but not the boy's drawing." He pulled the crumpled sketch from his pocket once again. The fire. The train. The scream only one person heard. What if, Holmes began, but stopped short. "What?" Watson asked. But Holmes had gone still. His eyes were fixed beyond the platform, at the edge of the trees. They crossed the narrow lane behind the station and followed a footpath swallowed in bramble and ash. Birds scattered as they walked, and the earth grew softer, spongy underfoot. At the end of the path stood an old railman's shack. Boarded windows. A roof near collapse. And on the front door, a symbol scorched into the wood, a railway lantern, upside down. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "I've seen this before," he said. "But never in any public directory. It's a signal used by dismissed conductors to mark dangerous sidings, places where the tracks have been taken, but not the warning signs." Watson glanced at the mark. "Someone's trying to say this place is haunted. Or forbidden," Holmes replied. "Which is often the same thing in the eyes of a guilty man." They pried open the door. The hinges moaned like they'd forgotten the sound of movement. Inside, the room was small, one wooden chair, a rusted stove, and an old telegraph machine, long dead. But on the wall above the desk, pinned carefully between two nails, was a sheet of parchment. A map. Not of Blackthorn, but of under Blackthorn. Holmes stepped forward. A maintenance diagram. Rail tunnels. A spur line, that leads to the very foundations beneath the station. Watson frowned. "But this shows a second platform. A hidden one." Holmes smiled grimly. Blackthorn Station was once a hub. 2 platforms. One buried. Forgotten. He turned to the door. "We're not looking for a man who vanished on Platform 2, we're looking for someone who may have been taken to Platform 0. Later that evening, as the sun fell behind the trees, Holmes and Watson returned to the station with lanterns in hand and ropes across their shoulders. They had found the entry in the maintenance shed, a trapdoor behind a disused signal box, its hinges rusted and iron handle cold as bone. Watson descended first, the rope creaking under his weight. Then Holmes. The darkness swallowed them. The air grew thick. Dust of decades past choked their lungs. The lantern cast shadows upon brick and steel, and there, beneath the surface of Blackthorn, they found it. A tunnel. Forgotten. Unused for 40 years. And at its end, an old platform. Cracked. Silent. But not empty. A chair. A coat. And on the ground, scratched with something sharp into the stone floor, I saw the train. It never stopped. Holmes inhaled. Slowly. And then, somewhere beyond the wall, a low rumble. Not mechanical. Not human. Watson whispered, "Did you hear that?" Holmes nodded, eyes narrowing. The tracks may be dead, but something still rides them. Chapter 4: The Man in the Photograph. Blackthorn, though modest in size, harbored an uneasy weight in the air the next morning. The fog that clung to the countryside now seemed less like a natural mist and more like a veil drawn over truths long buried. The villagers had returned to their quiet rhythms, or at least pretended to. Holmes, however, had risen before dawn and made his way to the small general store where the telegraph office was tucked behind shelves of barley, tobacco, and lye soap. He sent 2 telegrams before breakfast. One to Mycroft. The other to Scotland Yard. Both succinct. Both coded in his usual fashion. Why Mycroft? Watson had asked over a silent breakfast, the fire popping gently in the inn's hearth. Because Blackthorn isn't merely forgetting. It's hiding, Holmes replied, his eyes fixed on the corner where rainwater pooled beneath the tavern window. And my brother's network hears whispers even the wind refuses to carry. It was late morning when a carriage arrived from the city. Not a police cart, nor an urgent messenger, but a well-dressed man with polished boots and a face too stiff for a countryside visit. He introduced himself as Mr. Avery Brant, a legal liaison for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. "I'm here on behalf of certain dignitaries. Miss Kettering's disappearance has caused unease," Brant said, his voice syrupy and cool. "We trust you'll handle this with utmost discretion, Mr. Holmes." Holmes tilted his head. "Strange. The girl worked a railway booth. You speak as if she vanished from the Queen's own parlor." Brant's face flickered. Holmes nodded slightly. "Ah. So there's more than a girl. There's a secret." Watson saw Brant's jaw shift. A lawyer's instinct said silence. But Holmes' presence had the uncanny ability to unravel even trained tongues. Brant offered only one thing before excusing himself. A folded piece of card. An old photograph. It was among her belongings. The ministry thought, you might find it relevant. Watson leaned closer. It was a black and white portrait. A group photo, 6 people standing before a bricked wall with ivy crawling over it. 3 men in military uniforms. 1 in a clergy collar. 2 women. One of them unmistakably Miss Kettering, a decade younger. And the other woman? Holmes stared, then turned the card over. No names. Only a year, 1879. He tapped the shoulder of one uniformed man in the image, a tall figure with sharp eyes, standing slightly apart from the rest. "Watson," he said quietly. "This man is not unfamiliar. I once saw his name whispered in reports from the Afghan War. Captain Alaric Mordain. Vanished. Declared dead. But..." Watson frowned. "But?" Holmes smiled faintly. "But dead men do not send letters in invisible ink." Watson blinked. Holmes tucked the photo inside his coat and stood. "We need to find that wall. That ivy. And more than that, we need to know who the second woman is. Because this," he tapped the photo again, "this is no village memory. This is a monument to something buried deeper than we've yet dug." That evening. The rest of the day unfolded like an unsettling dream. Blackthorn Station remained closed. The inspector sent from Scotland Yard, a young man named Drewer, had very little to offer but apologies and the cold reassurance that nothing yet had been found along the tracks. Yet something had changed. That night, Watson found Holmes sitting by the window, unmoving. A candle burned beside a letter he had opened, not the one he received that morning, but a new one, slipped under the door while they were away. It read, "You must stop. She was never meant to be found. If you do not turn back, you will unbury more than bones. You will unearth wrath. No name. No signature." The wax seal was a simple black stamp. A crescent moon. Holmes turned to Watson with his usual composure, but his voice carried a note that was not fear, nor surprise, but fascination. "They are watching," he said. "Which means we're close." Watson frowned. "Close to what?" Holmes stood and picked up the old photograph once more. "Not just the truth, my friend. But the reason they buried it." Chapter 5, Ivy and Echoes. The morning light in Blackthorn was pale and uncertain, the kind of light that seemed afraid to disturb the secrets of the town. The fog had not lifted. It clung to the low hills like a mourner's shawl, and the trees remained still, as if listening for something that had not yet been spoken aloud. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson left the inn shortly after dawn, armed with little more than walking sticks, overcoats, and the faded photograph Brant had left behind. "There's something odd about the ivy on this wall," Holmes had said over tea that morning. "Look closely. It grows in a pattern, not freely as ivy usually does, but tightly, almost like it was guided to cover something." Watson had nodded, squinting. "A plaque? A sign? Perhaps a seal. Or a message." Now, they walked the outskirts of Blackthorn village, guided only by the photo and Holmes' instinct. They passed mossy fences, hollow barns, and stone ruins that had once been cottages before time had its say. But it wasn't until they reached the eastern edge of town, where an abandoned chapel loomed behind a wall of elder trees, that Holmes came to a sudden halt. "There," he whispered, pointing. The structure ahead was skeletal, a church long forsaken. Its bell tower was gone, likely collapsed decades ago, and the stained glass windows were shattered into quiet rainbows on the stone floor inside. But what drew their attention was the outer wall behind it, half covered in thick, green ivy. The pattern, now that it had been seen once before, was unmistakable. Watson pulled out the photograph and held it up. "It's the same place." Holmes moved toward it, brushing away leaves and stems. His hands moved carefully, methodically, until something metallic glinted beneath the greenery. A rusted plaque. Holmes crouched and cleared the vines from around it. The engraving was worn, but legible. "In memory of those who served and vanished, 1879. A pause. Then Holmes exhaled slowly. "There's the year again. Same as the photo." Watson leaned closer. 6 names. All men. None of them Alaric Mordain. "Exactly," Holmes murmured. "He's not listed. And yet he stood with them. So either this memorial is incomplete, or it was meant to omit him." Watson rubbed his jaw. But why would they erase a name? Especially a military man? Holmes turned to face the ruined chapel. "Let's find out." Inside the chapel. The chapel's interior was silent save for the soft tapping of Holmes' shoes on the flagstone. Nature had reclaimed most of the building, vines grew through cracked mortar, birds nested where angels once looked down from the rafters, and the altar was little more than a stone slab now chipped and blackened. But Holmes wasn't interested in the altar. He was looking at the floor. "Here," he said, kneeling by a loose stone. With Watson's help, he pried it free, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside was a metal box, badly corroded but still intact. Holmes lifted it gently. He blew dust from the lid and opened it. Watson stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. Inside the box were several items: a folded letter, a small brass key, and a faded blue ribbon tied around a bundle of newspaper clippings. Holmes carefully removed the letter and unfolded it. The ink was nearly gone, but the words remained. "To whomever finds this, know that we tried to speak, but the silence was forced upon us. Alaric lives. He fled not for shame, but to protect the girl. The child. They were after her, not him. And they will come again if the truth wakes. The others paid the price. I fear I will too. R.K." Watson looked up. R.K., one of the names from the plaque. Holmes nodded grimly. Reverend Kerrigan. The man in the clergy collar. He then untied the bundle of newspaper clippings and scanned the headlines. Blackthorn incident, ministry denies civilian loss. Girl found in field, unconscious, identity withheld. Captain Mordain cleared of charges, vanishes during transit. Watson swallowed. So it was about the girl. Holmes turned toward the shattered windows, as if watching a memory replay there. She wasn't a witness. She was the reason. A visit from the vicar. That afternoon, as Holmes and Watson studied the items from the chapel, a soft knock echoed through their room at the inn. Standing there was a man in a dark coat and round spectacles, Reverend Pell, the current vicar of Blackthorn. A man known for avoiding scandal and conversation alike. He looked uneasy. "I heard, from the innkeeper, that you've been exploring the chapel," he said, voice quiet but edged. Holmes offered no expression. "We've been exploring many things." The vicar hesitated. "That building is cursed, Mr. Holmes. It is better left in peace. And yet it holds names that were not meant to be forgotten." Pell shifted. "There are things not meant to be remembered either." Holmes stepped closer. "You know something about what happened in 1879. "I was a boy then," Pell whispered. "But I remember the silence. The grown men crying behind doors. And the night that the girl screamed." Watson's brow furrowed. "What girl?" Pell's eyes flicked between them. "Her name was Elsa. She was found in the fields, just before the frost. No family. No past. Some said she came from the asylum. Others said, darker things. But Captain Mordain took her in. Protected her." Holmes folded his arms. "And the others?" Pell's voice dropped. "They wanted her taken. By force if needed. She knew something. Or was something. I don't know. But one by one, the men who tried, died." There was a terrible pause. Then he added. "The ones who stayed quiet, lived." And with that, he turned and left. Back at the station. That night, as the wind howled against the tavern shutters, Holmes and Watson returned to Blackthorn Station. The building was still sealed, the investigation officially suspended, but Holmes had acquired the key through less than official channels. Inside, the station was cold and lifeless. Dust floated in the moonlight like forgotten breath. The booth where Miss Kettering had worked stood empty, a half-finished cup of tea still on the shelf. Holmes moved quietly to her desk, pulling open drawers until he found what he was looking for. A false bottom. He pried it open. Inside was a small envelope addressed not to her, but to Elsa Kettering. Watson blinked. Her real name? Holmes opened the letter. They found me again. I thought I was safe here. But someone recognized me, the man from the photograph. He's not dead. He's watching the station from the hills. If I vanish, tell Holmes. Tell him the chapel holds more than stones. Tell him the knife never rusted. The letter stopped there. Torn. Holmes stood slowly. She was the child. Grown up. Hidden in plain sight. Watson's voice was dry. And now she's vanished like before. Holmes looked out the window, where the hills rolled into the fog beyond. No. She didn't vanish. He turned back. She was taken. Chapter 6, A Map of Shadows. The rain, once a mere whisper on the station roof, now tapped with growing urgency, as if time itself had grown impatient. Sherlock Holmes stood at the hearth of the guesthouse parlor, his gaze fixed not on the fire, but on the crude map unrolled upon the oak table. Beside him, Watson sipped lukewarm tea, his brows drawn low in concern. It is not a question of where Harold Finch disappeared, Holmes murmured, his fingers brushing a penciled mark on the map. It is a question of how he vanished without leaving behind the echo of a step. Watson leaned forward, squinting at the smudged ink. You suspect the disused tracks behind the station? He asked. I suspect everything that hides in plain sight, Holmes replied. Blackthorn, with all its melancholic charm, had begun to shift in Holmes's mind, from quiet village to coiled riddle. Its trees seemed to whisper, its stones reluctant to speak. And on that map, Holmes traced the old, forgotten routes, a stretch of abandoned tunnel beneath the village, marked faintly in a surveyor's hand. The tunnel had once belonged to an earlier rail line, closed 2 decades prior, sealed due to structural collapse. But had it stayed sealed? There's one man, Holmes said, turning to Watson, who might know what lies beneath the floorboards of this town. The man who builds them. Thomas Brigg? Holmes nodded. The carpenter. And more importantly, the one-time foreman during the tunnel's final reconstruction. If anyone in this village remembers the veins that run under its surface, it's him. Thomas Brigg lived at the edge of the woods, in a crooked house that looked stitched together by a stubborn spirit and little else. When Holmes and Watson arrived, they found him working with chisel and mallet, shaping a new doorframe. He did not smile when he saw them. You're from the station? He asked. We're here about the tunnel, Holmes said without ceremony. The one beneath the old line. Brigg paused. Haven't thought of that place in years. But you remember it, Holmes pressed. Brigg nodded slowly. Long, deep thing. Damp as a grave. They sealed it off with stone and iron after the cave-in. Said it wasn't worth the cost to repair. Was it ever reopened? Not officially, Brigg muttered, rubbing his beard. But there were rumors. Children said they heard voices beneath the floor. Dogs wouldn't go near the eastern woods. And 2 winters ago, a group of boys swore they saw lights flickering in the tunnel mouth. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Where is the entrance? Brigg hesitated. It's not easy to reach. Half the hill collapsed over it. But, there's another way. He led them to a stack of dusty sketches and papers. One, a blueprint of the tunnel's original structure, revealed a secondary entrance, an old ventilation shaft that opened into the forest behind Blackthorn Station. Holmes took the paper like a priest receiving a relic. By late afternoon, Holmes and Watson stood before the shaft. It had been hidden well, ivy-grown and crumbling, but not well enough. The iron grate that once sealed it had been sawed clean through. Recent. Inside, the shaft sloped downward, its bricks sweating with moisture. Watson hesitated, but Holmes pressed forward without pause, lantern raised. The narrow descent grew darker, colder, the silence swallowing every sound but their breath and the occasional drip of water. Then the path widened. They emerged into a great stone chamber, the heart of the old tunnel. Its ceiling arched high, cracked in places. Rusted rails still snaked through the ground, partially buried beneath dirt and time. And there, at the far end, stood a small table. Upon it, a single gas lamp burned. Watson stiffened. Someone's been here. Recently. Holmes approached the lamp, eyes scanning the surroundings. Papers lay scattered beside it, notes written in a jagged hand. Not Finch's. No signature. Just phrases. No one will believe me. She sees me watching. The station breathes. Holmes gathered them carefully. A journal of someone unwell? Watson asked. Perhaps, Holmes replied. Or someone far too sane for Blackthorn's liking. But it was what lay behind the lamp that held Holmes still. A door, crudely constructed, sealed not with lock and key, but with nails driven deep into timber. Something had been kept in. Or kept out. Holmes touched the edge. Then a voice echoed faintly, far behind them. Not words. Just breath, a gasp, carried by tunnel air. Watson drew his revolver. They turned. But the passage was empty. Yet something had moved. Something knew they were there. Back in their lodgings, Holmes laid the papers upon the floor. Patterns emerged. The notes were not diary entries, but signals. Messages. And they pointed to one terrifying truth. Finch had not disappeared in a moment of madness. He had followed the voices beneath the town. He had gone willingly. And he was not alone. There's a design to this madness, Holmes whispered. A map, of shadows. And we are walking it now. Chapter 7, The Midnight Ledger. The clock inside Blackthorn Station struck midnight, a sound too loud for a place so quiet. It echoed down the stone hallways, across empty platforms, and through the dimly lit telegraph room, where dust lay undisturbed like a shroud. Holmes stood alone, his silhouette cut in two by the weak flame of a nearby gas lamp. Watson had gone to retrieve Lestrade from the inn, and until then, Holmes was left with his thoughts, and the ledger. It had been hidden behind the old stationmaster's desk, a narrow, weathered journal bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of mold and tobacco. He had found it not by luck, but by a simple logic. The desk drawers had been emptied too neatly. As if someone wanted them to appear untouched. But the bottom panel of the desk had a false base, and beneath it, this ledger had waited. Holmes placed it on the dusty counter beside a flickering oil lamp and opened the first page. The writing was erratic. Long loops of ink, sudden blotches, inconsistent slants. Not madness, but panic. September 6th. Another knock at the window tonight. The same hour as before. I dared not look. Holmes turned the page. September 9th. The child saw him. She told her mother. Why is no one listening? Another page. September 11th. The signal lantern was lit. No train due. Why did the light change from green to red, then back again? I must record everything. The entries went on like this, fragments of fear, names mentioned only once then never again. Holmes's eyes darted across the pages, soaking in every line, connecting thoughts with timelines, but one name appeared more than any other. Thaddeus Blake. The station porter who vanished without a trace. Who clocked in one evening and was never seen again. Who, according to this ledger, had raised concerns about the incoming freight cars from Briarwell, a line supposedly shut down since the mine collapse 3 years earlier. Holmes whispered aloud, "What cargo moves on a railway that no longer exists?" He flipped to the back of the ledger, where pages had been violently torn out. The last entry was dated 2 days before Thaddeus disappeared. Blake has seen too much. He says the cargo isn't coal. I told him not to return to the platform at night, but I know he will. The signal was lit again this evening. That train should not be running. I fear it carries more than metal or stone. Holmes closed the ledger gently. The sound it made as it shut was like a coffin lid. Just then, footsteps echoed behind him, not Watson, not Lestrade, but someone lighter, quicker. Holmes turned sharply. A girl stood in the doorway, barefoot, wrapped in a patched shawl. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. She couldn't have been older than 9. I saw the train, she said softly. Holmes crouched slightly, so as not to alarm her. What train, my dear? She glanced over her shoulder. The black one. It comes without a whistle. No steam. Just shadows. Mr. Blake followed it that night. So did my brother. Holmes's heart slowed. Your brother? She nodded. But only I came back. She pointed at the wall behind Holmes, where the station's old schedule board still hung. Her finger trembled as it settled on a route no longer used, Platform 3, Briarwell Line, midnight freight. There's no Platform 3, Holmes said. The girl shook her head. Not during the day. And with that, she turned and ran, her bare feet silent against the stone, leaving behind no trace but a sudden, unearthly chill. Holmes stood frozen. The station had no known Platform 3. It was built with 2, that fact was unquestioned, architectural, historical. But something gnawed at him now. A whisper in the fog. A knock at the window. A platform that appeared only at midnight. He walked slowly to the far end of the station, where weeds grew through broken tiles and a rusted sign still warned, "No access beyond this point." But beyond that point, something was waiting. A sound. A shift in the air. A pulse, deep and mechanical. Holmes took a breath, and stepped past the barrier. Chapter 8, The Platform That Shouldn't Exist. The moment Holmes stepped beyond the rusted gate, the air seemed to grow heavier, not with fog, but with something more, ancient. The ground beneath his feet, once uneven and forgotten, now felt like pressed stone. The broken tiles gave way to smooth iron rails that shimmered under the moonlight, as if polished by unseen hands. There had never been a Platform 3 on any blueprint of Blackthorn Station, Holmes was certain. And yet, it was there. Stretched before him in solemn silence, veiled in shadows and mist, stood a narrow platform cloaked in ivy and soot. The number 3 hung above on a warped wooden sign, swaying gently though there was no breeze. No lights flickered here. No owls called. Only the distant, rhythmic hum, a mechanical breath, growing louder by the second. Holmes stood still at the edge, peering down the length of the hidden platform. And then, he heard it, a slow, creaking rumble from beyond the trees. Not a train whistle, no. This was deeper. A groan from the earth itself. The black train. It came without light, without smoke, just as the child had whispered. A series of shadowed carriages, moving as if drawn by some unseen force. Its wheels turned, yet it made no contact with the rail, it glided. The hum turned to a thrum, then a pulse, and the air around Holmes thickened with static. He did not move. Instead, he observed, sharply, with growing clarity. Each carriage bore the insignia of a long-defunct mining company, Briarwell Industrial Transport. The same company that had gone bankrupt after the mines collapsed, the same collapse that had supposedly buried 47 workers alive. But this train, it bore no passengers. Only crates. Crates sealed with iron bands, some leaking a fine silver dust. Holmes squinted. That dust wasn't metallic. It glowed faintly in the dark. As the train passed, he caught a glimpse inside one of the open cars. He froze. It was filled with mirrors, stacked and bolted, hundreds of them, all facing inward in a spiral. Some cracked, others perfectly smooth. And in those mirrors, Holmes saw not himself, but another man, pale, wide-eyed, as if trapped, screaming silently, his hand pressed to the glass. Holmes stepped back. Suddenly, a figure emerged at the far end of the platform. A lantern in one hand. A long coat. A limp in his step. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Not Watson, not Lestrade. It was the stationmaster, the man listed as dead for over a year. And yet he moved, deliberately, muttering under his breath, clutching the ledger Holmes had just read. His skin was pale as wax, but his eyes were wide with purpose. Holmes called out, "Who are you guiding this train for?" The man paused, as if recognizing Holmes, yet not surprised. "The night train doesn't wait for permission," he rasped. "It moves when the past stirs." Holmes advanced slowly. "What are in the crates?" "Memories," the man whispered. "The kind too heavy to bury. The kind they tried to forget." He dropped the lantern. It shattered, and the light went out. Suddenly, Holmes heard footsteps behind him. Lestrade and Watson had finally arrived, panting, flashlights cutting through the fog. But when they looked ahead, platform 3 was gone. No sign. No track. Just overgrown earth and crumbled stone. "What are you looking at, Holmes?" Lestrade asked, squinting into the darkness. Holmes said nothing. He was staring at the rails beneath his feet, now rusted, twisted, broken again. Yet, a small detail remained. His boot, once clean, was now dusted with fine silver powder. And tucked beneath the broken stone, he found the shattered fragment of a mirror, still pulsing faintly with reflected light. Watson stepped closer. "What in God's name happened here?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned to his old friend and said only, "The train has passengers. Just not the kind that pay fare." Then he looked to the stars, the night strangely quiet again. And from somewhere deep in the hills, a whistle blew. Chapter 9, Faces in the Glass. Holmes placed the mirror shard in his coat pocket, wrapping it carefully with a handkerchief. the silver dust shimmered faintly, even in darkness. Watson stood beside him, silent but tense. Lestrade, still catching his breath, looked pale as he muttered, "Holmes, are you going to tell me what we just witnessed?" Holmes didn't reply. Instead, he knelt where the tracks had been, running his fingers over the damp earth. It was as if Platform 3 had never existed. No grooves, no rails, no evidence, save for that one fragment of mirror and the metallic dust on his boots. The train had vanished like a memory one tries to forget, but never quite can. "I don't believe in ghosts, Lestrade," Holmes finally said, standing. "But I do believe in cover-ups, and I believe in machinery, buried, hidden, repurposed by those who would rather the past stayed silent." Lestrade looked at him, eyebrows furrowed. "Cover-ups?" Holmes turned toward the station house. "Come. I believe the answers are not in what was seen, but in what was left behind. There are records yet to be uncovered." Back in the dusty archives beneath the ticket office, a room forgotten by time, Holmes rifled through yellowed ledgers and brittle manifests. Watson lit the room with an oil lamp, the electric bulbs overhead having long stopped working. Holmes moved with purpose now, like a man chasing down the shape of something glimpsed in a dream. "There," he said, pulling out a faded leather-bound book marked Employee Injuries, Blackthorn Line. He opened it slowly. Page after page told the stories of those who once worked the mines near Blackthorn Station, men listed as injured, missing, or dead. But many of the names had small marks beside them, a faint X written in red ink. Nearly 50 such names, all dated within the same year, 1893, the year of the mining collapse. Holmes traced his finger down the list until he found it: Henry Ellard, signalman. Presumed dead in tunnel fire. He flipped another page. More names. More X marks. Then, suddenly, he found something odd. A separate list, tucked into the back of the book. It was handwritten, hurriedly, and the ink was smudged. Not a record of deaths, but deliveries. Each delivery matched a date. And beside each, the words: glass received. Mirrors formed. Faces compliant. Watson leaned over Holmes' shoulder, puzzled. Mirrors formed? Lestrade grunted. "What the devil does that mean?" Holmes stood up slowly. "I suspect the train we saw was not delivering people, but storing them. Transferring memories. Impressions. Perhaps even something more, animate. Every mirror on that train was facing inward, a prison of reflections. Have you ever heard of the old belief, Lestrade, that mirrors can trap the soul?" Lestrade scoffed but said nothing. Holmes turned again to the mirror fragment in his coat pocket. With a cloth, he gently wiped the dust from its surface. Watson leaned in. Good heavens! There it was. A face, not Holmes', nor Watson's. A man with hollow eyes, fingers pressed against the glass as if he could feel them. His mouth moved, as if silently mouthing something, something urgent. Holmes leaned closer. The man in the mirror whispered with trembling lips. "Help me." Holmes recoiled, but the image held. Then the face in the mirror flickered, and changed. Another man. Then a woman. Then a child. Faces upon faces, like memories skipping through a broken gramophone. Each one frozen in anguish. "There must be dozens," Watson said quietly, his voice shaken. "No," Holmes whispered. "There are 47. One for each man presumed lost in the collapse." Lestrade stepped back. You mean, they weren't killed? Holmes straightened. Not in the conventional sense. I believe something was done to them, a preservation of memory, or consciousness. A violation masked as a tragedy. The mining collapse was only the story they fed the public. But behind it, an experiment. Perhaps by that same company, Briarwell Industrial. Perhaps by someone else. Watson asked, but for what purpose? Holmes replied, to answer that, we need to go deeper. Back to the mines. That train was heading underground. There was a long silence. The rain began again outside, a soft patter against the cracked windows. Holmes placed the mirror shard in a small, locked tin and slipped it into his satchel. The answers lie below, he said. Below the earth. Below the records. Below memory itself. Then he turned to Lestrade. I'll need a lantern, rope, and full access to the sealed tunnels of Blackthorn mines. No red tape. Lestrade hesitated. That place hasn't been touched in 30 years. Holmes met his gaze, eyes cold and sure. Then it's about time someone broke the silence. Chapter 10, The Tracks Beneath the Silence. The wind that stirred the morning fog at Blackthorn Station had a peculiar gentleness, as if it were reluctant to disturb the air where secrets had once slept undisturbed. It moved along the empty platforms and rusted rails with quiet reverence, like someone walking through a room where someone had just died. Sherlock Holmes stood at the edge of the platform, hat low, coat unmoving despite the breeze, as the final pieces fell, not into place, but into understanding. The last 24 hours had delivered answers. But those answers were not without weight. The man presumed to have vanished, Arthur Linley, had not disappeared in the traditional sense. Nor had he been kidnapped, as Mrs. Linley had feared. And yet, it was not a simple case of misdirection either. No, what Holmes uncovered was a portrait of a man who had been silently vanishing long before he ever stepped on a train. Arthur had orchestrated his own disappearance, meticulously, patiently, aided by forged letters, false sightings, and a web of transactions tied to old debts and new promises. He was not fleeing danger but obscurity. His life, once full of promise, had wilted into routine. A clerk by name, a poet by heart, he had longed for freedom, for rebirth. The plan had been flawless, except for one crack. That crack was a boy. A station boy named Ellis, who had seen too much and said too little, until Holmes asked the right question. Was the man you helped that night the same man who arrived earlier that morning? The pause Ellis gave was everything. No, sir. He wore the same clothes. Spoke the same. But, his hands weren't shaking no more. And his eyes, they were empty. Like he'd already gone. Therefore, Holmes followed the only trail left, a mirror. Not a real one, but a man who bore Arthur's likeness. A cousin, long estranged, who'd agreed, for money, to impersonate Arthur just long enough to mislead the right people. While the Real Arthur walked out of Blackthorn in the dead of night, under a false name, and boarded a freight train 2 towns over. It was clever. Not criminal, not entirely. But devastating all the same. For when Holmes and Inspector Gregson finally caught up to Arthur, living under the name Francis Vale, in a seaside town north of Dover, he was not relieved to be found. Nor was he angry. He was simply done. I didn't run, he said. I let go. And in that moment, Holmes understood, this had never been about vanishing from the world. It had been about vanishing from a life that no longer felt his own. Arthur agreed to return, but only for a final conversation with his wife. Not to resume the old life, but to lay it to rest. Mrs. Linley wept, not out of anger, but from the strange comfort of closure. The fog lifted not with joy, but with understanding. And so the case was closed. Not with a trial. Not with handcuffs. But with silence, acceptance, and the slow winding down of a mystery that had, at its core, been a man's quiet cry for freedom. Holmes and Watson boarded the return train in the dusk. The station now empty, the ghosts stilled. Watson leaned forward. "You knew early, didn't you?" Holmes didn't answer directly. "I suspected. But suspicion is not certainty." Not until the silence began to speak. Watson nodded, watching the fading countryside pass through the window. "And will he be all right, do you think?" Holmes paused. Then, with something between regret and relief. "No man who vanishes is ever quite the same when he is found. But perhaps, that was his purpose all along." As the train pulled away from Blackthorn Station for the last time, the wind carried no secrets now. Only echoes. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. In the quiet places of memory, some voices still wait to be heard. Some mysteries do not demand solving, they ask only to be understood. And so I ask you. If you were Arthur Linley, would you have stayed? Let me know in the comments.